Hello and a warm welcome to another week of China Now with me, Makiza Latifa. In this episode, we dive into the intensifying chip competition as Chinese advanced chip design firm Huawei HiSilicon becomes the target of commercial espionage. The latest PLA documentary unveils tactics for a potential Taiwan amphibious landing, and China has completed a successful ground test for its manned lunar mission equipment, while more than 20,000 people pour into Beijing for a massive parade rehearsal. And 7 scientists have been celebrated with a prestigious Future Science Prize, sharing a total of 21.6 million yuan in awards. Chris is on standby with the full details. Stay with us.
Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report to the latest developments in China. In this episode, chip competition intensifies as Chinese advanced chip design company Huawei HiSilicon falls victim to industrial espionage. The latest PLA documentary reviews tactics for a Taiwan amphibious landing. China conducts successful ground tests for manned lunar mission equipment. And more than 20,000 people poured into Beijing for a rehearsal of the parade commemorating the 80th anniversary of China's victory over Japanese aggression in the World Anti-Fascist War. 7 scientists received the Future Science Prize with a total of 21.6 million yuan in prize money. The Future Science Prize is often referred to as the China's Nobel Prize. China Currents is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started. I'm Chris. Now let's start today's China Currents. Last week, a group of espionage cases stirred public anger in China. Huawei HiSilicon, one of China's most advanced chip design companies, recently exposed an internal commercial secret theft case. According to the court ruling, 14 former Huawei HiSilicon employees were found guilty and received varying punishments. The principal offender, Zhang Kun, was sentenced to 6 years in prison and fined 3 million yuan, while the remaining 13 received combined fines totaling 10.5 million yuan. The principal offender, Zhang Kun, is a former Qualcomm employee who joined Huawei HiSilicon in 2011, left Huawei to start his own company, unpack, in 2021. Zhang then recruited multiple Huawei HiSilicon R&D staff with high salaries and stock options, instructing them to obtain HiSilicon chip technology via transcription and screenshots in order to apply it to unpack's chips. Appraisals showed that the infringing chips has 40 key technologies with 90% similarity with Huawei's chips. Before all of this was exposed, Zhang's unpack has already secured multiple rounds of investment with investors including many Chinese state-backed institutions. With hot money in China closely pursuing the chip sector amid intense China-US tech rivalry, Zhang is unlikely to be the last person willing to take such risks. Moving on to Taiwan, a long-standing concern for the Chinese public, a recent military documentary aired by China's central television featured amphibious landing exercises, prompting serious reaction on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. In the documentary, PLA forces swiftly switched from training to combat mode. Amphibious armored groups and hovercraft landing vessels prepared for beach assaults, while drone swarms cleared the way, rendering traditional minefields and defensive fortifications powerless. In just 18 seconds, the PLA achieved zero casualty control of the area. Military commentators noted that these exercises could be seen as rehearsals for a landing on Taiwan. Next, China's lunar exploration program. On August 6, China's test of its lunar lander on Earth to verify stable landing and fault conditions operations achieved complete success. Named Lanyue, the lander is a key component of China's manned lunar mission. Designed to transport 2 astronauts between lunar orbit and moon's surface, it can carry a lunar rover and scientific payloads, serving as the astronauts' living energy and data center during their stay. Given the historical success rate of humanity's lunar exploration, fewer than 16% of the 150 lunar probes achieved successful soft landings. Chinese scientists are particularly keen on making Lanyue both lightweight and multifunctional. Huang Zhen, a scientist at China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, noted that its thinnest parts are no thicker than a soda can. We must achieve the most complex, exquisite design with the smallest launch weight. Next, let's switch gear and look at China's massive rehearsal for its upcoming parade commemorating the 80th anniversary of China's victory over Japanese aggression in the World Anti-Fascist War. Around 22,000 people poured into central Beijing last weekend to take part in the rehearsal near Tiananmen Square. The actual parade is scheduled for September 3rd, with global leaders including Russian President Vladimir Putin and Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko expected to attend. Some foreign media noted that the Beijing parade rehearsal took place on the same day Japan marked the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, which hastened Japan's unconditional surrender. Though some Japanese have worked hard to portray Japan as solely a victim of the World War II, it shouldn't be forgotten how 35 million Chinese died as a result of Japan's invasion. Finally, we will conclude the China's Nobel Prize, the Future Science Prize. On August 6, the Future Science Prize announced its 2025 winners. 7 Chinese scientists received awards in life sciences, physical sciences, and mathematics and computer science, with each category carrying a prize of 7.2 million yuan, equal to that of the Nobel Prize. The Future Science Prize, launched in 2016, is a privately funded award recognizing outstanding scientific achievement made in mainland China, Hong Kong, Macau, or Taiwan. This year's Life Science Prize went to Ji Qiang, Xu Xing, and Zhou Zhonghe for discovering fossil evidence that birds evolved from dinosaurs. Their work transformed the birds from dinosaurs hypothesis into a widely accepted scientific theory. The Physical Sciences Prize went to Fang Zhong, Dai Xi, and Ding Hong for contributions to the computational prediction and experimental realization of topological electronic materials. Fang Zhong explained one application: topological materials can achieve resistance-free electron transport, reducing chip heat generation and lowering energy consumption, potentially offering massive competitive advantage in AI era. The Mathematics and Computer Science Prize went to Lu Zhiyuan, who pioneered next-generation non-volatile memory technology, a super USB drive that retains data without power. His research extended chip lifespan, increased capacity, boosted speed, and reduced size, further advancing AI, mobile communications, and cloud computing. That's all for today, and thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts or comments, please leave them below, and see you next time.
Thank you, Chris. That wraps up China Currents for this week. Now we journey into the Thinkers Forum, where some of the sharpest minds share ideas that help us see China and the world in new ways. Our first guest is Michael Hudson, a towering figure in economic thought whose work as a distinguished American economic historian has reshaped how we understand global finance and power.
Even if they open their markets, as Japan also just did, this doesn't mean that Asian countries are actually going to import more American autos or American rice or American products, because Asians prefer Asian cars, like so many Americans prefer Asian cars. And the Japanese especially prefer their own rice or even Korean rice to American rice. So on the surface, it looks like the United States is going to achieve huge new markets. The question is whether the Asians are going to respond in the way that Canada did, to a kind of nationalistic resentment against the United States bullying them into trying to open their markets and make America the main winner in any deal. If America's the winner in an international trade deal, that means the other country must be a loser. And the populations of other countries don't like to be losers, and they're feeling increasing resentment. So what seems to be a victory for Trump in the very first look turns out to be he planting the seeds for resentment and a reaction against the United States. You're seeing this already in Japan, for instance, when Japan is beginning to talk with Korea and China about plan B? How do they shift away from their reliance on the United States, given the fact that the United States is going to push them to make more and more sacrifices of their own economy just to benefit the United States? It's a one-sided, unfair philosophy of how to negotiate international trade that's supposed to be of mutual benefit. The idea of mutual gain is now replaced by American first policy that the United States has to be the gainer, other countries have to be the losers. You can imagine what other voters in other countries are going to respond and their own buying practices. Trump is putting pressure on the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. Meanwhile, American prices are going up. If America lowers its interest rates, if the Federal Reserve is forced to reduce it, there will be a large outflow from the dollar into foreign currencies. Already there's an outflow into even the euro, despite the euro's economic problems, and into Asian currencies, and most of all into gold. So the BRICS countries, like all the other countries in the world, realize that they've lost 10% of the value of the US dollar, and hence US stocks and US bonds, is valued in their own currencies. So if you're a foreign central banker, and even if you've made 4.5% on your holdings of Treasury securities, if the dollar's exchange rate goes down 10%, then you've actually suffered a 5% loss. Other countries, especially the BRICS, are moving into gold. They're moving into each other's currencies. They're looking at some kind of safe haven away from the dollar. So what Trump is doing in trying to spur the American trade balance by lowering the dollar's exchange rate is causing a dollar outflow that is offsetting any benefit to the United States. The question is, the BRICS can't really have their own currency yet because that would require political integration like you'd have in Europe. What they can do is create a new central bank that would only deal with credits and debts among governments themselves, among central banks and national treasuries, to help finance trade deficits and trade surpluses. Meanwhile, transacting trade, imports, exports, and investment in their own currency and their own payment system, such as China's developed, is much more efficient and lower priced, lower cost than using the SWIFT system. So you're having an outflow from the US banking system and the Euro banking system also, and that will cut the profits of US banks in their foreign exchange commissions, their foreign exchange dealing. It will be much more efficient for BRICS countries to trade among themselves, and there will be large gains, especially for their central banks, but also for the populations. If interest rates are, say, 4.5%, but inflation is 8%, and Nouriel Roubini, for instance, expects inflation to be 8% in a year or two, well, you can imagine that that means that the price-adjusted return on an investment at 4.5% actually involves a loss of about 6% and self-defeating, basically. So the inflation is going to spur an outflow from the dollar because the role of central banks, including the Federal Reserve, no matter what Donald Trump may tell them to do, the central bank's role is to prevent inflation. Its idea of doing this is to raise interest rates. Well, when a central bank raises interest rates, the effect is primarily on stock and bond prices, not on consumer prices. And so the rise in interest rates to deal with the inflation is going to cause the stock and the bond markets to go down. And investors are going to see they're going down, and they're going to move their money out of the dollar into foreign currencies, foreign stocks, foreign bonds, and into gold that it doesn't have this prospect for loss. We're dealing with a perfect storm against the dollar as a result of Donald Trump's fantasy about how the economy works, and it turns out to be the inflation that he's caused by imposing the import tariffs that he's doing is going to accelerate the move out of the dollar and raise interest rates and cause a financial outflow into foreign currencies that is going to catalyze the move by the BRICS to say we've got to protect ourselves from taking a loss in the dollar holdings that we have. Instead of a problem, it's a quandary. A problem has a solution. A quandary doesn't have a solution. A quandary is there's no way out. Anyway, any direction in which the United States moves at this point is going to be destructive. For instance, in addition to imposing the tariffs that raise prices here for consumers, the Trump administration has stopped all anti-monopoly enforcement. Companies in the United States are raising their prices using the excuse of Trump's tariffs as a kind of umbrella permitting them to raise it. And the Federal Reserve says, well, this is not a monetary problem. Tariffs raise prices have nothing to do with the money supply and interest rates. Monopoly pricing is independent of the money supply. It's going up all by itself. But the only tool that the Federal Reserve has to counteract it is to raise interest rates. So all of this is putting such a squeeze on foreign dollar holders that it's leading to a flight for the exit from the dollar. The problem is how the BRICS countries have not yet gotten together and created a common alternative. That's what they're trying to do right now. And it's up to them to create a political alternative to this that is just beginning to take shape. What Trump has done is catalyze this movement that is inevitable at some point, maybe 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, that other countries will break free of the dollar system. Well, Trump has now accelerated this greatly. He's created almost an emergency pressure. Leave the dollar now. And the question is how it's going to be done because the BRICS countries have so many different economic philosophies. China and Russia are taking the lead in all of this for other countries. So it's going to be up to China, Russia, and the agreements that they make with neighboring Asian countries that's going to determine what the BRIC system is. And it may be that not all BRICS countries will go along with it. So we're talking about a China-centered system because China is the only economy that is large enough to provide an alternative to the United States. The question is, how is it going to do this? The global countries, South countries, have lost their economic sovereignty as a result of their financial debt. There's no way that the global South countries can pay the debts that they've run up really since 1945 and have enough money for the government to invest in the infrastructure that is necessary for them to take off. The dollar system is more than just using dollars. It's an international tax system and a legal system. And so the global South countries for the last 200 years have operated as part of an entirely different kind of economy than the European and North American economy. The whole takeoff of the Industrial Revolution in Europe was getting rid of the landlord class, getting rid of land rent, getting rid of economic rent, getting rid of monopoly rent, and creating their own banking system. The global South countries didn't have any of this. They've instead of dealing with a landlord class like Britain did in the 19th century, their land, their mineral rights, their oil rights, their privatized public utilities are all owned by foreign investors. And the foreign investors essentially are extracting all of the rental value of the natural resource rents of their oil and raw materials. So the only way that the global South countries can get sovereignty is number one, saying these debts that we emerged from World War II with a lot of international reserves. We had surpluses that we'd sold our raw materials to the countries that were fighting World War II. But then it's all been depleted. The trade policy that has been enforced by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank has led us into chronic balance of payments and trade deficits. It's imposed a kind of economic theory that's driven us into debt. And as a result, the creditor countries that have invested in our bonds, that have lent money to us, including the IMF and foreign governments, have made loans to us without any idea how we can repay the loans. The fact is that if we are to be a sovereign country and use our own national patrimony of natural resources and our own income to develop our economies and to diversify, to do for our economies what, for instance, China has done for its economy, we cannot afford to use our economic surplus to pay foreign bondholders. The debts that we have are odious debts. They're debts that were imposed on us by the International Monetary Fund, by the World Bank, by U.S. economic policy, without our benefiting at all. And that's the legal definition of odious debts. So the global South countries will have to say, now that President Trump has imposed heavy tariffs on us, he's prevented us from exporting to the United States and earning the dollars to pay foreign bondholders. So we are together calling for a moratorium on all global South debts. Just as in 1931, there was an international moratorium on German reparations and inter-allied debts because they realized that the debts cannot be paid. And the global South countries cannot repay their foreign debts if they are to be sovereign. They also would have to do what Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and all the classical economists advised the European countries and later the United States for their industrial takeoff. You tax economic rent of raw materials. If you have land or natural resources or public utilities, you tax away their super profits, their unearned rents, and you use that as a tax base instead of taxing labor and industry. Well, the IMF tells countries you can get rich if you only impoverish your labor force, lower your wages, prevent labor unionization, and you'll be more competitive. But that hasn't made them more competitive. That economic austerity that the IMF and the United States has forced on global South countries prevents them from getting out of their debt dependency and their financial dependency. The question is, whose interests are the global South countries going to be first? Their own economic growth or payment to foreign bondholders and payment to foreign investors who've bought up their natural resources and who've been forced by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to privatize their public domain, their public enterprises, their transportation, their communications, their water supply, all to privatize all of these into monopolies that extract all the profits and rents and send them abroad. The global South countries have to keep their economic surplus at home instead of paying foreigners. That's going to be the great question that's going to shape the economic and political discussions for the next few decades. Just restructuring the existing debts is not enough. Restructuring is saying, all right, we'll lower the interest for right now, kick the problem down the road in the future. The fact is that the debts have to be explicitly repudiated. That's the first thing. Not restructuring. There's no way these debts ever can be paid if the global South countries are going to use their surplus to rebuild their own economy in a way that they've prevented from doing for the last 200 years. This is a problem that goes way back to the 1820s when countries began to win their independence from the European colonial powers. Haiti, Mexico, and in Europe, Greece, Egypt, Tunisia, they all won their independence. But once they got political independence, they were able to free the slaves in Haiti and Latin America, but they had to borrow money to build up the industry that the colonial powers never provided them with. And as soon as they issued bonds for Haiti and Greece, they defaulted almost right away, and the defaults ran up. And by the end of the 19th century, the global South countries succumbed to the problem that they have today. Foreign creditors were assigned to take over their national monetary commissions in all of these countries, Egypt especially as an example. And the foreign monetary commissions took control of the fiscal policy of the global South countries that were indebted, and that's all of the global South countries. A state and a government is really a tax system. Who's going to be taxed, and what are you going to spend the tax revenues for? And the foreign monetary commissions that took over the global South countries in the late 19th century, and then again after 1945, the Bretton Woods International Monetary Fund, the foreign monetary commissions put the interest of the creditor nations, the industrial nations that were running trade and balance of payment surpluses first, and the interest of the debtor nations at the very bottom. So the global South countries need to say it's time to put the indebted countries first. 85% of the world is indebted to 15% of the population. And the entire financial system, the tax system is all run for this 15%. And it's denominated in foreign currency. It's time to put the interests of the 85% first, and that requires an ending to the whole system that has been put in place, not only since 1945, but all the way back to the 19th century. There has to be a political restructuring of the economy, and that will lead to the ability of the global South countries to tax the profits and the rents of the oil companies, the mining companies, the forestry companies, the foreign agricultural owners, the foreign investors in public infrastructure, all of the money that they've been extracting from the economy and sent abroad will be kept in the host countries themselves. And even the word host country, the word host is a biological term for the host of a parasite that finds a host. Well, you could say that the whole international economy is divided in that same way, and the global South countries and the BRICS and the global majority don't want to be hosts anymore. They want to be sovereign countries that can do for themselves what the industrial nations of Europe did and what China has done in following pretty much the same economic policy, reinventing the wheel that was first developed by industrial Britain, France, and Germany, and then the United States, in developing its own industry, and most of all, keeping its banking and its money creation in the public hands instead of letting foreign banks siphon off all of the credit in the form of interest and sending to their home offices abroad. The Keynes Bancor that he designed in 1944 was an alternative to the International Monetary Fund. It's a statement that if there's a country running a chronic trade surplus at a certain point, this accumulation of savings from it will be given up. And if country or group of countries is in chronic deficit, moving more and more into debts to this new central bank that is extending credits and debt, the member central banks, there will have to be a clean slate. The idea of Keynes' Bancor was to prevent debts from growing up beyond the ability to pay. And when he says that countries that run a chronic balance of payments and monetary surplus, as the United States did after 1945, when it increased its proportion of gold holdings all the way to 80% of the world's monetary gold by 1950. When that happens, increase is wiped out, basically, because you realize that if countries fall into a debt trap, that they can't pay the debt, they have to be rescued and free themselves from debt so that they can use their money to grow. So this forces the creditor countries, in this case largely China, to make sure that when it makes a loan, its lending policy is not like that of the International Monetary Fund, not like that of the United States banks and bondholders, but it makes sure that it makes loans that are solvent loans and can help countries generate the money to pay back the creditor by making tangible capital formation. In the West, the financial system does not make loans for capital investment. They'll make loans to buy for corporate raiders to buy an industrial corporation and then carve it up. They'll make loans to corporations to buy their own stock and pay dividends and increase the stock price, but they won't make loans to finance industrial investment. To the extent that China and other countries make loans to increase capital investment, above all by governments in the form of infrastructure, to lower the economy's cost of doing business by having better transportation, better communications, better public infrastructure in general, then this is a productive loan. And Keynes's Bancor was designed to make sure that countries followed this philosophy of make productive loans, not unproductive usury type loans. Long before Russia had to mount its special military operation in 2022, Ukraine was already the most corrupt country in Europe, according to the World Bank and according to everyone else. The Ukrainian economy was created as a kleptocrat economy. In fact, that was the neoliberal plan for Russia and for all of the post-Soviet countries after 1991. The idea was to take all of the public wealth of Russia and other countries and turn it over to individuals. The factory owners were given, instead of running a factory for the state, the ownership of the factory was turned over to the head of the factory, or to Gazprom, or to mineral rights. So the whole neoliberal idea of post-Soviet development from Ukraine to Russia to everywhere was kleptocracy and corruption and insider dealing. The agency that Zelensky canceled was set up specifically by the Democratic Party to promote its main donors in Wall Street and the financial sector to take over the economy, especially Burisma. And the job of the anti-corruption agency was to protect the corruption, to make sure that there was no other authority that could interfere with the corruption that was put in place by the Biden administration and earlier American administrations to essentially use a client oligarchy to support the United States and drain this country. So Zelensky essentially abolished that when the corruption agency began to find that apparently the most corrupt individual was President Zelensky, who members of parliament said had taken $10 billion a year. All this money that's being poured into Ukraine from the Americans went to the government, to maybe 1,000 Ukrainians. And the money that was given to Ukraine by the International Monetary Fund in the United States wasn't really given to Ukraine. It was given to the managers of Ukraine, the politicians and the kleptocrats, the few 4 or 5 families that control the Ukrainian economy, and it was all corrupt. And if you're going to be corrupt and you want to protect your corruption, you want to control the police force. You want to control the corruption commission. So you go after the little guys, the individuals, and protect your own corruption. That's the role of almost any police force in the West and any anti-corruption organization. We're dealing with an Orwellian rhetoric here.
And next on the Thinkers Forum, we welcome Kagiso TK Pooe, Associate Professor of Political Science and Governance at the Witt School of Governance. With his deep expertise in governance and policy, he brings a sharp, insightful lens to understanding China's role on the African continent and beyond. Stay with us.
I always do find it interesting that when you speak to Chinese scholars and just policy makers, one of the key points of reference for governance and the technological advancement is the idea of the century of humiliation, and how that has driven China to say, listen, we never ever want to go back to what that looks like. Now, my hope would be that in South Africa, we not only say we never want to go back to apartheid, but also say we never want to go back to colonialism. But I would argue that the Chinese have found an instrumental way of being able to take the centuries-long years of humiliation and turn it into, I'd say policy tools in terms of how do they think about technology, and also how do they think about the reviving of their culture. I would argue when the state does well from having centuries of colonialism, or what the Chinese call century of humiliation, in South Africa we call apartheid and colonialism, it should actually spur on civil servants to say, when you have a bedrock of civil servants that understand that history, and the state and the instrumentality of that state allows them to do their job, they understand that it's not like a private company where profit is the motive, but it's rather how do we ever ensure that we never go back to that time again. I think the South African civil service post 1994 started well, but I think most South Africans and civil servants and the citizens will agree that there has been a regression. I would argue that it's been a failure on the part of our politicians to firstly not allow civil servants to do their work in the correct way, and also to not prize the idea in the mind of civil servants that you're working to ensure that you never go back to a situation of humiliation. Humiliation is inability to make choices as a state as you would like. And looking at our current situation as of tomorrow, I think the South African government is going to be under 30% tariffs from the United States of America under President Trump. Now, when I say the South African state started well, if you look at the way the South African economy is structured, South Africa's exposure to America, yes, it's to other global powers, including China, doesn't go beyond 10 or 11%. We kind of spread it quite evenly. But I think the mistakes we have made has meant that we have not been able to be in a position like the Chinese government has. When tariffs under Trump occur, we are almost frozen with fear and paralyzed with what do we do next. I think it's between 1994 and 1997 in South Africa, our accession to the World Trade Organization. Looking at it now, I think we could have learned from the Chinese to say, you do not simply enter those institutions which have got a history and have got a pathology, what economists might call path dependency, without making sure that you have internal stability. When we look at stability, we look at global stability, which is important. But looking at the history of China from when the Soviets collapsed, when the Soviet system collapsed, and also post the era of Chairman Mao, when Deng Xiaoping took over, there was a concerted effort to ensure that internal stability is prized above everything else. A state which has no internal stability is not a state. It is simply a powder keg waiting to explode. The fact that the Chinese pick an industry and they are slow to learn it, want to be experts in it, and then when they're ready to internationalize it. And one key industry here which comes to mind is the industry of critical raw minerals. And for those that are not maybe familiar with the idea, it's a bit of an oxymoron. They're not really critical raw minerals as such, but they are minerals which, when put together, are critical because of what they do. Namely, that they are in the minerals that speak about the future economy, which is a digital economy of the world. You have to go back, and I think you can go back to the 90s and to the early 2000s when you read the I think policies on the four modernizations, when you read the Chinese Communist Party documents. Even then, people were not quite sure, why would they pick debt? What is the obsession with looking at this debt? Well, as we found out during the Trump tariff negotiations with the Chinese, when Trump decided to go in the direction he did, the Chinese simply just needed to remind him that, listen, if you want to go in the direction of percentages, we'll also put these on your critical raw minerals. And what we've seen, or what we saw, was a very humble United States of America president. So that really does beg the question for a country like South Africa, which has a lot of these critical raw minerals. When do you decide to move from simply digging up these things to making them an industry? Because that's what the Chinese were able to do. They took what is there, they made it into an industry. And I think it's a key lesson. But I think the key lesson here is not so much that you should use them, that's a given, but it should be the issue of be deliberate, even if you seem to be slow, but build the industry. Make sure that you're experts in the industry. So again, which speaks about the graduation of saying, when I say take your time, it means you go from critical raw minerals to understanding battery technology. What we're now seeing, the outflow of this, is what we see on South African roads. Haval, GWM, BYD, who now dominate the smart cars and technologies and batteries of the future. But what I think the Chinese play very well, they don't say it loudly, but I think history shows us a policy is they simply say, you also need to make sure that when you come into the country, you invest in the human capital so that our people also understand what is happening. And this maybe speaks to the broad-based Black economic empowerment in South Africa, which had the same thinking, which is to say, you cannot simply come into South Africa and take, but you need to also be able to say, what are you going to share with? But the key lesson we should be asking, and we should put front and center, is how do you ensure that you invest into our higher education and education institutions and science and technology? And that is why I think the policy, which was, I think, China 2025, which the Chinese government, after having built the space, was able to say, listen, the next industry is, the next economies of the world is going to be led by the Chinese.
And that brings us to the end of this week's edition of China Now. A big thank you to our guests, Michael, Hudson, and Kagiso, for sharing their invaluable insights, and to you, our cherished viewers, for joining us on this journey through China's stories and the ideas shaping its place in the world. Until next time, my name is Makiza Latifa. Stay curious, stay informed, and have a wonderful weekend. See you same time next week.